On the night of April 13th, 2024, and into the following morning, Iran staged a large strike against Israel, using drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles. What unfolded next was a bizarre series of claims and statements with worldwide implications, and is therefore worth a closer look. That is especially true given that it seems like Iran intentionally sabotaged its own operation. Yep, the whole thing is perplexing. So today, we will begin with the background behind the attack, what Iran actually did that night, whether this will be the end of the affair, and the broader complexities of the attack and its consequences, with a special eye toward the awkward geopolitical position that Russia now finds itself in, and what this means for Ukrainian missile defense. Finally, I asked you guys what else you might want to hear about, and I will cover some of the extraneous questions at the end. But we begin with the background behind the attack. For context, and at the risk of delivering the hottest of hot takes, Iran and Israel do not like each other very much. Up until the attack in question, the current phase of the conflict was a proxy war, with Iran supporting Hamas to Israel's west, Hezbollah to the north, and Houthi rebels at the end of the Red Sea, and also with each supporting opposing parties in the Syrian civil war. In recent months, Iranian proxies have become more assertive, likely because Tehran has received an influx of cash from Russia via weapons trade. Hold that thought for later. The current attack traces back to Israel's April 1st bombing of a building adjacent to Iran's embassy in Damascus, Syria. 16 died, many of whom were members of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Following a period of mourning, which included this ceremony here, Iran promised to retaliate. U.S. intelligence, which just a month earlier had anticipated ISIS-K's attack on a Moscow theater, again issued a warning that Iran was serious and that it would happen rather quickly. This would be prescient. That takes us to the attack itself, and the night of April 13th, when Iran fired something like 170 drones, 120 ballistic missiles, and 30 cruise missiles at Israel. This is where things started to get bizarre, and left the world confused about what exactly was happening. Iran publicly announced the launch of the aerial assault, and almost immediately announced that the strikes were over. One slight detail: Shahed drones top out at about 185 kilometers per hour, otherwise known as 115 freedom speeds. Now, prior to this attack, Iran would use its proxies to launch strikes. The close proximity meant that older attacks would resolve almost immediately. Here, though, the bulk of the bombs originated from Iran. It is about 1,000 kilometers between Iran and Israel, meaning that Iran's announcement came hours before the drones would reach their targets. That type of speed might make extraterrestrial Tri-Solarans jealous, but it leaves the militaries of today unimpressed. It was as if Iran's earlier announcements were intended to forewarn everyone on what was about to happen. Forewarning aside, with Israel being well known for its air defenses, Iran's plan seemed to intend that the drones would overwhelm Israel's systems, thereby paving the way for Iran's more powerful ballistic and cruise missiles to hit their targets. Air raid sirens went off basically all over the country. However, for their part, Israel and company seemed to have little difficulty dispatching the vast majority of the deliveries. In addition, through means not publicly disclosed at the time of writing, the United States and the United Kingdom shot down a bunch of them before they got anywhere close to Israel. Jordan, also not enthusiastic about Iranian influence in the region, downed some more, but it was ultimately up to Israeli Arrow 3 and David's Sling platforms to mount a final defense. Israel claims that the outcome of all of this was that none of the drones reached their targets, none of the cruise missiles reached their targets, and only a small portion of the ballistic missiles reached Israel. Israel further claims that the damage inflicted was minor, and primarily to the Nevatim airbase, which was where the initial attack on Damascus originated from. Okay, now for the analysis. Is this the end of this phase of the conflict, or will Israel strike back? From Tehran's perspective, it seems like there is little interest in continuing. Heck, there seemed to be little interest in even starting it in the first place. This would help make sense of the PR campaign advertising the attack coming and its conclusion, all before any of the real action occurred. In other words, all signs point to Iran being more interested in broadcasting a message than dealing actual damage. Now, that might seem weird given the large number of drones and missiles that Iran sent westward, but such is the perverse consequence of fighting a well-defended target. If you just lobbed 15 projectiles at Israel, they might all get shot down, and then you did literally nothing, as opposed to close to nothing. The large firepower but early warning meant a lot of smoke, but no Israeli casualties, and thus less compelling need on Israel's side to strike back. Besides, if you control the domestic media, you can describe it as a success anyway. The joys of autocracy. And even if Iran did not go tit for tat with Israel on lives lost, estimates on the price tag that Israel paid to use its defensive net put it at an enormous number. Obtaining comparable figures for Iran is harder to come by, but one Shahed drone is estimated to cost between $20,000 and $50,000. Thus, even on the high end, the drone portion of Iran's strike was only $8.5 million. The real question about continuation falls on Israel, though. Netanyahu is in a precarious domestic position. He was unpopular before the Gaza war began, and he has not benefited from a rally round the flag effect, as one might suspect. So he may have a temptation to continue escalating the crisis and pray that things might change. But at some point, Netanyahu will have to cut his losses and move on. A more tangible problem here is the otherwise long-running U.S. support. Going back to that infographic, the alongside international partners part is doing a lot of heavy lifting. It is unclear whether this type of success would remain possible without the United States screening out a large portion of the weapons before they reached Israeli soil. The Biden administration, which as seen here was in the Situation Room following the attacks as they happened, adopted the position that Israel should take its robust defense as a win and move on, and that the United States would not support Israel if Israel wanted to retaliate further. This raises the potential cost of a continued conflict for Israel, and might push Netanyahu to err on the side of caution. Now let's tackle the broader implications that Iran's attack has for the war in Ukraine. We start with Russia's awkward geopolitical position, because it connects back to the previous point. A simple take here is that Russia and Iran are coalition partners of sorts. Now, because Russia appears to have adopted a burn-it-all-down disposition of late, the implication is that Moscow will fully support Tehran with its efforts regarding Israel. But the reality is more complicated than that. The main reason that the two countries have gotten along as of late is because of economic sanctions. Iran has been under U.S. sanctions since, well, forever, and as a result, Tehran knows how to build weapons without connections to Western supply chains. So when Russia found itself pinched by those same sorts of sanctions, the Kremlin had to go to Iran for support. This is why the money has been flowing from north to south, with shipments of Shahed drones going back in return, and then immediately turning around and heading slightly south. Tehran can do this because there is not a pressing need for it to use those drones. Rather, there is just a desire to cause some casual havoc in the region. However, if a broader conflict were to begin with Israel, suddenly Tehran would want to start keeping the supply of Shaheds for itself. In turn, Russia's allotment would be limited to whatever it has the capacity to produce domestically under an Iranian license. Even a limited conflict would risk Israel striking Iran's drone facilities, which would have long-run consequences for Russia. The West would also want to start funneling more weapons to Israel, of course, but this is still a bad trade from the Kremlin's perspective. The problem here is that the holdup in US aid to Ukraine is less about supply capacity and more about unwillingness to expand supply capacity. That is a complicated way to say that Russia benefits more from an end to hostilities between Israel and Iran than Ukraine does. Thus, we can expect Russia to walk a tightrope, perhaps not condemning Iran for its actions, while simultaneously lobbying Iran behind the scenes to let it go. This would also be consistent with Russia's broader policy in the region to have friendly relations with both sides. Lastly, we have what this says about Ukraine and missile defense. Right now, on a nightly basis, Ukraine sees missiles and drones raining down on its soil, similar to what Israel experienced on April 13th. Meanwhile, Israel has just demonstrated what a full-fledged defense system can do in terms of stopping such missiles and drones. Thus, a natural takeaway here is that the West could shield Ukraine from Russia's barrages, if it wanted to. Now, obviously, Western aid to Ukraine has been lacking of late, even if there is growing consensus in Washington that eventually a bill will pass. But the apparent solution is not so simple. One of Israel's biggest military vulnerabilities is that it is so small. An opposing army could run right through it if left with few restraints. But the upshot is that Israel can concentrate its missile defenses precisely because there is such little ground to cover. Ukraine, by contrast, is massive. 604,000 square kilometers to just 22,000 square kilometers for Israel, meaning that Ukraine is 27 times bigger. Well, the exact number depends on how you want to count the West Bank, the Golan Heights, Crimea, and the Donbass, but you get the idea. Never mind that there is much more space between Israel and Iran to intercept missiles, versus the direct path from Russia to Ukraine. So yes, some type of missile defense like this may be possible, but it would be much, much more expensive, and it would not be nearly as effective. As a final bit, I turn to some short Q&A. I asked you guys what you wanted to hear more about, and boy did you answer the call. I already answered a bunch of the big ones through the natural course of this video, but there are some shorter ones that are worth discussing. What does the attack mean with regard to ending hostilities in Gaza? I think the answer there is not much. We've previously discussed how Israel believes that there is a major difference between clearing 90% of Gaza versus 100% of Gaza, and nothing has changed here about that. That would change if Iran altered Israel's ability to conduct further operations. But because there was basically no damage to Israel, this is a non-issue for Israel. It may delay things a bit while Israel sorts everything out, though, which will probably please absolutely nobody. Considering that Israel and Iran do not border each other, will there even be lines on maps? As you already saw, sadly the answer is no. But as this reply in the comments pointed out, lines on maps are just a visualization for a framework that can still handle abstract issues. Here it is geopolitical influence in the region, which still has some sort of, applicability? How will this affect the currently stuck military aid in the US House? We touched on this already, but I think it is worth emphasizing that it probably does not change much. This is really an issue about Mike Johnson's speakership, and whether he can maintain it while still passing aid. Iran's attack might change that at the margins, but not significantly. Regardless of what happens in the House this week, though, I plan to do a video on that topic soon. Wouldn't it be a good opportunity for Israel to wipe out Iran's nuclear program? Probably not. I talked about this issue at length almost 2 years ago, and the problems are, 1, though the publicly available intelligence on this is bad, it may be that Iran could assemble a bomb, even if Israel attacked some facilities. And 2, a concerted effort to disrupt Iran's program would require boots on the ground. I could see Israel continuing its covert sabotage campaign here, but Iran's attack does not shift much of the overall wisdom. Why has my dad not come back from getting the milk? Sorry, son, but I just wasn't ready to be a father. You also denied the almighty lines on maps, so really, it's your fault. Anyway, if you want to learn more about either the conflict in the Middle East or the war in Ukraine, good news. I have playlists on both. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And I will see you next time. Take care.